copy of my speech here, delivered in a hermetically sealed envelope. And because I tend to wander a little bit when I speak, I digress. So anyway, here we go, folks. Okay. The most valuable gift with which my fairy godmother endowed me was curiosity, a trait lavishly nurtured by my parents. When combined with endurance in pursuit of goals and unashamed honesty about the magnitude of one's own ignorance, for curious individuals, life becomes an exciting treasure hunt, filled with childlike wonder about this world in which we live and about its inhabitants. It's been said that curiosity killed the cat. I believe instead that curiosity was framed, that it was ignorance that was responsible for the cat's demise. At least that's my feeling about it. Our world is extravagantly supplied with magical stuff, just waiting for us to become clever enough to discover. Curiosity led me to T.B. Kaler's door, to another adventure animated by those things curiouser and curiouser. I've had the pleasure of spending time with Nobel laureates and others with treasuries of specialized knowledge who either sought contact or accepted my invitation to share insights or to reflect on areas of obscurity. I must admit they were drawn less by my sparkling personality than by the unique problems of the research vineyard in which I labored. Again, curiosity. And these folk were remarkably generous to me in what they shared. I felt I needed a more effective communication base with which to discuss behavioral issues with warriors and other skilled men of action, most of whom had a more marginal interest in things psychologic. To offset these deficits, I spent time with Eric Byrne and Bob Goulding, who taught me the extremely useful tools of transactional analysis. Now, Dr. Kaler had received the Eric Byrne Memorial Scientific Award as a major TA contributor and had gone on to develop the separate discipline of process communication model. They are not derivatives one of the other. They are separate. Both transactional analysis and process communication helped greatly in meeting the communication needs unique to my NASA duties. Though my Air Force research duties remained primary, I had been designated NASA's lead psychiatrist for manned spaceflight, one of the functions of which was screening astronaut candidates for evidence of any worrisome mental health issues. I felt the need to upgrade my skill set in evaluating highly intelligent, technically skilled applicants who had a possible investment in obscuring any unattractive personal data. I had a number of good things going for me in terms of the NASA assignment. I'd been piloting aircraft since age 15, instructed by an unconventional but extremely talented ex-barnstormer who knew all the tricks. He'd sometimes just chop the throttle on me and say, "Find a place to land," and I'd carry it right into the ground. So I brought to the new job a lifelong interest in aviation and very modest attainments as a civilian pilot. In terms of psychiatric background, I was the product of one of the finer psychiatric residencies of the time and had done well enough to be invited to join their staff. Later, I became a board examiner for the American Boards of Psychiatry. I was a well-grounded USAF flight surgeon who had broad experience with the Air Force inventory of aircraft, virtually everything that was flying, but had done the lion's share of my flying out of fighter test, whose test pilots I served as the unit's flight surgeon. My primary military assignment was an aerospace research billet, doing physiologic and psychophysiologic research on hot problems, including the transition to space. I would, on rare occasion, get a call from the Surgeon General's office, and they'd say, drop what you're doing. There'll be a courier on your doorstep tomorrow morning. We don't worry about funding. Don't worry about subjects. There is no time for animal experimentation because people are dying now. And that's the way some of these problems would present. It's so pragmatic. I really enjoyed that kind of research. Now, if I can get back to where I lost my place. I had experienced the good fortune of some notable successes, including producing the first operationally practical pressure suit for combat operations at extreme altitude, and the first operational cardiac pacemaker defibrillator, which I built to protect volunteers in hazardous but necessary human research. So I had become a quiet but recognizable entity in the aerospace research community with a low radar profile and a go-to reputation that fit NASA's needs. I had combat and black ops experience and had actively engaged in productive support activities with other arms of the military. I even already knew a few of the astronauts because I had flown with them in their test pilot halcyon days where they had done so well. So I surfaced unobtrusively at NASA, having morphed over the years into a physiologist, flight surgeon, internist, psychiatrist, research wonk, and a very, very happy camper. I was psychiatric consultant to the Air Force Surgeon General for Europe and the eastern half of the United States, and had been a participant in NASA's Scientific Advisory Board. I'd also served as deputy surgeon for one of the air commands and knew the administrative ropes. Hey, was I prepared or what? Alas, pride cometh before the fall, sometimes by midsummer. My extended background did not fully prepare me for the task at hand. It takes a lot of education to realize how much you don't know. And I have learned there is great wisdom in acknowledged ignorance. It not only protects you from sustained error, it also invites you down the pathway of discovery. So when I begin to hear of a few of those, how's this guy going to react if the hatch seal starts to squeal when he's 150 miles straight up type questions, I knew I had miles to go before I sleep. The field of resilience was yet to be so designated, and Resilience 101 was not on anybody's transcripts. Mining the world literature did not unearth the nuggets I sought. But while on my expedition into the behavioral science wilderness, I encountered a native of unique ability and depth of knowledge, Dr. Kaler, I presume, who was to share with me a treasury of insights on personality structure and behavioral prediction, and to become a dear friend. I invited Taby to participate in an astronaut selection cycle in '77. It had been my habit to spend about an hour and a half to 2 hours with each applicant. And these were hardy candidates who had already survived rigorous qualification review before even being invited to come to NASA Houston for round 2 of this process. During the interview, Dr. Kaler sat quietly in a corner of the room, and after the first 10 minutes or so, he would make a brief note on a pocket tablet and let it slide gently to the floor. When we compared notes after the interviewee had left, Taby's note showed that he had acquired more pertinent information in a few minutes than I had in an hour plus. I was hooked. I cheerfully became the student of a remarkable young guru. Of all the learning opportunities that have been strewn in my path, I count the time spent under Taby's friendfluence as the most pragmatically valuable. Now, when you act as a consultant, the determinations of your path are multifactorial. I offer that word for those perfectionists amongst you. What is the nature of the institution? Does the institutional culture differ from the norm? With what spectrum of personnel will you interact? What are their special needs or sensitivities? How can your activity best be tailored to meet both administrative goals and the practical needs of the target group? What's the burden of the message to be carried? And what authentic features of the messenger are likely to be facilitatory or off-putting? It's to be remembered that NASA is basically an engineering institution, and that engineers are seldom preoccupied with matters behavioral unless they're gumming up the engineering problem. They are more engrossed with removal of engineering glitches than with psychodynamics. Additionally, NASA very much needed public support, and they were very chary about any visible blemishes or the hint of a need for anything other than standard support measures. Ergo, they were not primed to publicly embrace something like PCM. Military pilots are also a bit leery of physicians. Doctors have the capacity to take from them what they value most, their ability to fly. Commonly, it takes time, skill at your trade, and that's a big item, honesty and flexibility to be accepted on a personal level. An ample slice of non-assaultive humor helps, but you need to earn your spurs with them. As noted earlier, I generally maintain a relatively low radar image, but it's valuable to have enough neutral visibility to be accepted as a legitimate, non-threatening presence any place on the campus. I was free to roam the local NASA terrain unfettered. From the choices available, I selected an office away from flight medicine and off the usual beaten paths, because pilots, especially those belonging to elite groups, are reluctant to be identified as seeking psychiatric aid. But it was not a secret that I was open to informal contact outside of flight medicine. Some of the very best and the least offensive chose to explore their curiosities as well as personal issues even when not distressed. But that was not the usual case. It was not uncommon for me unofficially to see personnel in their homes after hours. Administratively, the astronauts were expected to have non-controversial public images. For years, marital conflicts were submerged and divorces simply did not occur. Jack Lausma, a much admired straight arrow astronaut's astronaut, is blessed with an intelligent, warm, empathic wife, Gracia. That name is so appropriate to you. And Gracia became the natural mother hen mentor for most of the younger NASA wives. She quietly organized a wife's group, which I served as consultant teacher. It was an informal group where sensitive topics were openly engaged, and the sessions were held unobtrusively in secure home environments off the reservation. I used Taby's process communication model and transactional analysis as my primary modalities for teaching solid behavioral principle. Individual sessions, apart from the group, were quite available. The group had longevity. We went a long time, years. It proved an effective avenue for those wives to learn key PCM principles that helped them both individually and in marriages to spouses who worked in a remarkably pressured environment. Over the years, I've become quite eclectic in both my clinical and teaching activities, tailoring the approach to the needs of the individual and to his or her character, rather than using a one-size-fits-all mode to which the already troubled individual must subsequently adapt. I've found much to admire in analytic theory, and I made note here of psychoanalytic diagnosis addition to and/or psychoanalytic psychotherapy, both by Nancy McWilliams. They are real winners, not requiring a major technical background to read. Very sensible books. The Unconventional Methods of Fritz Perls, who wrote In and Out of the Garbage Pail, wildly different from commonly accepted modes, can be quite successful with subgroups inaccessible to the more common approaches, but sometimes very difficult for the more inhibited therapist to employ. So I have gradually become a therapeutic carnivore, digesting and selectively applying whatever mode seemed to match the individual's need, still influenced heavily at core by the PCM personality compass. Talking Swahili to a Swede is likely to be far less rewarding than engaging him in his native tongue. You betcha. In evaluating astronaut candidates, I constructed a single-page report geared to describing the general character of the individual, base and phase, notable strengths, vulnerabilities, prime motivators, major psychological needs, an ordering of the most effective to most aversive management styles to which he would likely respond, a rank ordering of communication channel preferences, potential distress sequence along with triggers and early warning signs, perception sequence in terms of thought, feeling, action, compatibility with other personality types, and preferred environmental milieu, team versus solo, external learner versus internal motivation. Some people better when you tell them things, other people want to do it their way. It ended with a general suitability rating for astronaut duty, 4 levels from excellent to serious reservations, and a few explanatory comments if indicated. The report was meant to be a user-friendly, single-page summary of the man's character, strengths and vulnerabilities, interpersonal style, plus suggestions to aid management in paths to maximize his potential. The utility of these reports was intended to go beyond astronaut selection and into duty assignments. My evaluation form had much in common with that described in the recently released book, Parlez-vous Personality, by Collignon, Legrand, and Parr. No surprise, both forms are based on Kaler's PCM. A tip of the sombrero to the authors of this opus. It is a beautifully constructed guide to PCM, a must-have for any serious student of the craft. Longevity at NASA also gave me the opportunity to validate anticipated phase changes in individual astronauts. I was blessed with unobtrusive observational access over the entire length of many an astronaut career, a remarkable educational opportunity. I note that I have used the word unobtrusive repeatedly. It is singularly appropriate to my function within NASA. For the better part of 4 decades, I served as NASA's lead psychiatrist for manned spaceflight, spending about 20% of my professional time on the turf at NASA Houston. My interactions within NASA went far beyond the astronauts in flight medicine, at both casual, social, and at an off-record problem resolution level. I became privy to many of the subtle undercurrents of the institution and to a number of veiled intrigues. It is disarming as the Venus de Milo might note, that people will share unsolicited, what they will share unsolicited if they have a need and if they trust you and if your past counsel has led them to become more effective in their own personal interactions. I have spent long periods submerged in academic settings, both as student and teacher. Have served as an advisor to business and industry. Have been at some point a consultant to the hierarchy of each of our country's major religious groups. Functioned in the military in both normal and covert operations. And what has all that diversity taught me? Though stated goals and occupational activity differ, they all have the same cast of characters. Even in religious groups espousing compassion and acceptance, you will find the deceitful, control-oriented aspirant for a position of greater power, a wolf in sheep's clothing, sometimes misleading other sheep who remain clothed in their official sheep's apparel. Similarly, you may experience the empathic warrior who, even in the heat of battle, lends aid to a disarmed but bleeding enemy combatant. Basically, life's a people business. And I have found PCM not only the best flashlight to illuminate dark interpersonal pathways, but also to clarify the better options for rendering support. I used PCM in many ways in my effort to serve NASA. For example, using PCM-derived insights on a small number of occasions, I informed select personnel in charge of individual missions that there existed a potential for significant conflict within a designated crew. Most commonly, the team member felt to be the focus of disharmony had been appointed primarily for political reasons, either homegrown or as a gesture to a friendly allied nation. The response was commonly in the, "That's not an engineering problem, that's in your ballpark" vein. Crewman replacement was not entertained by those with the power to do so. Having dutifully reported my concerns, I was now free both to alert the mission commander and to coach, again unobtrusively, the more vulnerable crew member I felt could use some help in thwarting the anticipated gamey activity or the friction of the discordant personality. Basically, I used PCM to improve skills at verbati, the verbal art of self-defense, and a combination of game theory, transactional analysis, and PCM to upgrade skills at avoiding enmeshment in the unhealthy games of others. Following the only flight wherein the predicted friction did not become visible, and it was a remarkably short flight, only 5 days, that's a real short flight. I encountered the man I had coached in a quiet corner on his return to NASA Houston. His response to my friendly "how'd it go" meeting was to stop briefly in thoughtful silence before responding, "One more day and I'd have killed him." He was an overkill persister, unmodified, and his antagonist had strong rebel and promoter components. Conflicts amongst hard-working and physically uncomfortable crew in a confined space, surrounded by major external threats, with no place else to go to avoid an antagonist, is more than an inconvenience. It's like being required to spend an uncomfortable week in itchy woolen long johns while you need simultaneously to be highly focused on other demanding tasks. PCM, both within NASA and in daily activity, has become for me like McGuire's Swiss Army knife, always with me and endlessly useful. Now, if PCM is such great shakes, why not trumpet that NASA's success to encourage use of such valuable technique by other investigators and therapists? First, and as underlined earlier, my position at NASA was that of a technically competent consultant supplying a support service that publicly verged on superfluous, like being the designated dance director for the local cemetery. Lots of people under me, but no complaints. The public facade of wholesome behavioral stability in the astronaut corps was to be maintained. Institutional embarrassments were to be avoided. Discussion of the use of a technique such as PCM might imply a need that the institutional posture denied. It could also catalyze further limitations on other worthy behavioral activities. Secondly, NASA eschewed being a publicity vehicle for products. Remember the transient but rather zealous advertising campaign for Tang, a refreshing in-flight libation used early in the program, rapidly followed by cessation of its use by NASA and the sudden abandonment of that brief but vigorous advertising campaign. A third and major element to my muted activities was that it allowed me to be more effective in dealing with the usual Byzantine machinations of institutional hierarchy. It was advantageous not to attract unnecessary attention that might energize antagonists to impede even very neutral activities. The only serious unfriendlies of which I became aware at NASA fell into two general categories. There was a small cadre who had reason to view me as an impediment to their personal agendas. There were several, one within NASA and several outside, who harbored their own aspirations to become lead psychiatrists for manned spaceflight. Now, permit me a digression, and I do digress a lot. That's why I stick to the usual shrink's eye view of manipulators contains all of the following four. A conflict of goals between the manipulator and his institution or significant other. 2, the behavior is deliberate, quite intentional, not accidental. The behavior is deliberate, also evolved to cover or further a deceit. And 4, a sense of triumph over having put something over on others. Characteristically, they have contempt rather than compassion for those they've deceived or to whom they have done some form of grievous harm. They feel the one-upsmanship glow. If such people are able to lever themselves into positions of power, they frequently cultivate a chain of others who receive rewards for their services but manage to get their hands just dirty enough that they cannot later become a witness for the prosecution without simultaneously indicting themselves. A carefully constructed information network is commonly deployed, sometimes by bringing aboard a surfeit of others under his control, presumably being prepared for a future need, but in the meantime, farming them out to other key departments as gratuitous help. Help, in this case, who innocently keep the generous gifter aware of what's cooking in those other departments. Sometimes the clusterings at mid-morning coffee break are used as coffee gossip listening posts, primarily as a friendly listener. Rare inquiries are likely to be about an authority figure's management style rather than about his character. That's going to target the type of data that the individual needs. This type of person also does not limit himself to just one coffee group, but casually sits in with many, gaining a broader scope of gossip while eschewing the type of group identification that might diminish returns from alternate groups. The committed manipulator is not above bringing aboard an individual of training that duplicates that of a troublesome opponent, after carefully screening the applicant for personality traits that will allow for mutual exploitation and guilt enmeshment. Such a person can be used to undercut the opposition and to fool some of the people some of the time. They're also useful as scapegoats, dirty hands and all, if some maneuver goes belly up. Experienced behaviorists have seen all of those maneuvers and more. Actually, the study of power and its use fascinates me. But be of good cheer. All is not dark. There are weeds in every garden. I remain convinced of the basic goodness of most of our peers and their instinct to do the right thing. Personal power is seductive, but it can also be intimidating in the wrong hands. In response to attempted sabotage, after confronting the issue at hand, I lean in the direction of the old Spanish motto, living well is the best revenge. It helps me maintain an acceptable self-view. Besides, it irritates the hell out of vengeful opponents who thrive on their ability to deliver a sustained negative impact. Eventually, they'll punish themselves. It's fascinating how personality disorders do this. That's a topic all by itself, how they administer their own punishment. Preemptively, I stress that what I have described here is not unique to NASA. It's not an uncommon institutional pattern. The struggle for power at high levels attracts not only the worthy, but the unworthy. Using unworthy here is not a reflection of a lack of technical expertise or business acumen, but of deficiency in areas more humanistic. Those enamored of power for power's sake usually find it insufficient just to become the designated boss. Not uncommonly, they feel the need to engage in games of domination and submission, the goal of which is to remind you that they have the muscle. And at a deeper conscious or unconscious level, to compensate for feelings of inadequacy or rage generated in childhood. In my tenure at NASA, reward or punishment for individual astronauts depended largely on being responsive to the wishes of their prime controller, a person of unquestioned intelligence, but with a rather Machiavellian view of issues ethical. The end justifies the means, and all that rot, don't you know? That's the residue of an old English friend. Space mission crew assignments were the golden apple, and he controlled that. Astronauts represent a highly select group of intelligent, well-trained, experienced, courageous, adventuresome individuals who would be chiefs anyplace else rather than being cast in Indian brave status at NASA. They have superior leadership abilities of their own and a strong tendency to state their views. When the golden apple of mission assignment is in the hands of a power merchant, both morale and productivity are at risk. A person of such convictions will often perform duty functions with notable skill when the work content does not impinge on their personal agenda. This, after all, helps them ascend the ladder of power. Power which they can accumulate to such an extent that even their official superiors hesitate to oppose them for fear of retaliatory measures. Warren Buffett lauded the trait trio, I should say, of integrity, intelligence, and energy in employees, but noted that without integrity, the other two can kill you. Fortune 500 companies have been brought down by intelligent, egocentric leaders. I unobtrusively help targets evade or offset many unfair punitive activities generated by the power merchant or by members of the team of enmeshed fellow travelers he had generated. And I watched that chain be developed step by step. I have related only a few expository examples, but the recounting of more would not serve the goals of this presentation. Though personally fascinating to me, the uses and abuses of power will not be further addressed here, except to offer two pertinent observations. Number one, PCM was a formidable tool in facilitating the effective defenses taught those who found themselves pressured inappropriately. Number two, I was told by a highly placed insider that the reason I wasn't vengefully destroyed by the powerful administrator in question was that my mission support and behavioral predictions were the most utilitarian they'd ever experienced, and that helped the wayward administrator look good. In essence, I was more valuable alive than dead. Because of widespread unofficial contacts at all levels of NASA, and that served me so well, but in the military as well. I didn't treat airman basic any different than I treated a general, and they tried to treat everybody with respect. Because of widespread unofficial contacts at all levels of NASA, top to bottom, and into various alcoves within the Washington Beltway, I became privy to some remarkably dark episodes. Of these confidences, I have remained largely silent unless I could meaningfully support their offset. Manipulators of the type I have described are notoriously vengeful and have elephantine memories. They make dangerous enemies. In the process of opposition to highly arbitrary or vengeful activity, I have run some risks and sustained some notable scars, but suffer from no chronically painful or persistently suppurating wounds. I am grateful for the complex experience. No pressure, no diamonds. It was worth the risks. I have no hypertrophied need for the stimulation provided by conflict or chaos. I do admit I've always had a burr under my saddle about bullies and have not been slow to lend support to the intended victim's position. Ever notice how often bullies travel in small packs, mutually covering with their numbers the denied inadequacy resident in their individual cores? Fortunately, I learned early the wisdom of rendering help rather than inappropriate rescue. I also recognize I harmonize very strongly with those who place high value on personal integrity, both in self and others. I need to be able to give a smiling thumbs up to that hombre I see in the morning, every morning when I shave. Today, NASA is run by a talented ex-astronaut for whom I had much respect when he was mission active. One of the good guys, Charlie Bolden, who went on to become a 4-star Marine Corps general after taking a hiatus from NASA. Most of the major perpetrators of mischief to whom I have alluded have been quietly purged from the system. I watched NASA's remarkable start with solid, transparent leadership and highly motivated young engineers tackling complex problems that had never even been posed before. I was told Nixon viewed NASA as a Kennedy creation, and not being a Kennedy aficionado, bureaucratized the institution to his need. It's had many a struggle, and as the blame shifters oft intone, mistakes have been made. But it has achieved much. I have focused here on some of the negatives within NASA because problem resolution is the grist of this presentation. That is not meant to denigrate NASA or its leadership. Manipulative followers of Machiavelli exist within all major institutions, particularly the more high-powered ones. And the dangers of faulty leadership as described can sometimes go uncorrected far too long. In most human institutions, you will encounter the full spectrum of personnel, from the heroic, honest achiever to the self-serving manipulator. There are good men aboard in NASA, trying to maintain the course on a turbulent political and economic sea. NASA's a bit like that treasured uncle who drinks too much. He's not perfect, but we still love him. In conclusion, have a good day, unless you have alternate plans. Or better yet, have whatever kind of day you want. Thank you. Oh, shucks.